The harmonic vocabulary of black metal and death metal often diverges greatly from standard functional harmony. It's something you can develop an intuitive feel for after getting some experience with these genres, but I found it challenging to analyze on a deeper level. What makes these harmonic techniques really work? I think what's needed is a good example, a track which takes a highly conceptual approach to this vocabulary and whose exploration of it is comprehensive enough to be expanded into a more general framework. One such example is the track Altopiano Celeste off of Vertebra Atlantis' 2021 album Lustral Purge in Cerulean Bliss. This is a very complicated piece of music, and fortunately I had a little help. I reached out to Gabriele Gramaglia, the guitarist behind Vertebra Atlantis, and he was kind enough to clarify some of the more difficult parts of the transcription. He also gave me some insight into his compositional process, so many thanks to him. I should also mention that there will be another Vertebra Atlantis album released this October entitled A Dialogue with the Eeriest Sublime. I'll put a link in the description so that you can check it out. One track has already been released and it's pretty awesome. But in the meantime, I want to show you the inner workings of Altopiano Celeste. Let's take a listen. The track opens with a solo guitar section. We start with this B-flat minor major 7th arpeggio, so it seems like we might be using a B-flat harmonic minor or melodic minor scale. But soon we get both a G natural and a G-flat, and later on a D natural, which would need to be borrowed from one of B-flat's major modes. In general, this track tends to revolve around a B-flat minor key center, but there are conflicting notes and chords at every turn. So while it's tempting to start putting functional harmony labels on everything from the start, it soon becomes apparent that this strategy will not work. Nonetheless, even without chord functions per se, there are obvious patterns that govern this composition. One such pattern is the resemblance of the B-flat minor major 7th and the G-flat minor major 7th chords. These both contain D-flat, F, and a D-flat augmented chord. There are also a few other groupings of notes in this section which are drawn from whole tone scales. It turns out that these features form a major compositional theme in this track. Since we'll be discussing them a lot, here's a quick refresher. The whole tone scale is a 6-note scale, which, as you might expect, consists entirely of whole tone steps. For most scales, each of the 12 possible root notes produces a different set of scale notes. But because every step in the whole tone scale is the same size, it has a strong translational symmetry. A whole tone scale starting on B-flat has the same notes as one starting on C or D or E, etc. As a result, there are only 2 different whole tone scales. For the sake of consistency, let's call them the B-flat whole tone scale and the A whole tone scale. 2 whole tone steps add up to a major third interval, and 2 major third intervals stacked on top of each other form an augmented chord. Each whole tone scale therefore contains 2 different augmented chords. These chords consist entirely of major thirds, so they also have translational symmetry. A B-flat augmented chord contains the same notes as a D augmented chord and a G-flat augmented chord. Applying these concepts to Altopiano Celeste's A section reveals some striking patterns. The presumptive key is B-flat minor, but in the first 3 measures, every note besides B-flat belongs to the A whole tone scale. In contrast, the notes in the 4th measure belong to the B-flat whole tone scale, sort of pointing back to the B-flat that begins the riff. The next repetition elongates the B-flat whole tone section at the end, and uses this to pivot a major third downwards to the G-flat minor major 7th chord, whose root note is likewise in the B-flat whole tone scale. Due to the symmetries of the whole tone scale and augmented chords, moving by a major third is almost like not moving at all. From here, we follow a similar pattern, using the A whole tone scale, except for the G-flat root note as our exception note, at least until we run into this D natural, which breaks from the established order. This phrase is clearly analogous to the one in the previous line, though. In fact, if we had modulated up a major third at the beginning of this second line, D would have been our root note, and this phrase would have fit the original pattern exactly. The 4th measure returns to our original pattern, using notes from the B-flat whole tone scale, but here there is another exception note. A C-flat from the A whole tone scale is placed at the bottom of this chord, forming a C-flat minor major 7th, kind of a nod to the other minor major 7th chord structures throughout the A section. The pattern continues from here, with the phrase in the 7th measure even giving us what we might have expected in the 3rd measure. But then the section ends with 2 minor flat 13 chords. These chords don't seem to follow any particular whole tone trend. Perhaps the G-flat minor flat 13 is a bit like the G-flat minor major 7th, mixed with that one D natural exception we allowed earlier, but the F minor flat 13 is even more of a digression. Yet, this chord change has quite a few strengths. To begin with, it has this downward chromatic chord planing movement, which is actually rather similar to the chromatic changes between the 2 whole tone scales, also a semitone apart. We can especially see this chromatic movement in the augmented chords that the C-flat minor major 7th and the G-flat minor major 7th contain. But moreover, as the section repeats, the F minor flat 13 serves as a diatonic 5 minor chord to the 1 minor chord we begin with, a tantalizing taste of regular harmony. As you'll see, much of Altopiano Celeste's appeal lies in how it carefully balances its more abstract elements with regular harmony. In this section, the balance between whole tone scales and a few well-chosen exception notes tempers the eerie sound of its underlying augmented chord structure by giving the momentary impression of regular minor scales. From this standpoint, the final F minor flat 13 chord is simply another one of these impressions. However, it also turns out to play a significant role in the transition to the track's B section. This section begins with some relatively simple arpeggios. The transition into this section entails a movement from F minor to D flat minor. These chords are separated by a major third, much akin to the general back and forth movement between the B flat minor and G flat minor in the A section. And once inside the B section, the D flat minor and B flat minor chords form a similar cycle. Both of these cycles entail a chromatic median relationship, but here they are separated by a minor third, departing from the A section's whole tone framework. The chord voicings in the B section also lean away from whole tones into more diatonic territory, with lots of simple minor triads. A new feature of this section is the usage of 2 overlapping guitar parts. In many cases they play in unison, but where they diverge we see old patterns creeping in. Consider the introduction of the C and E natural over this B flat minor chord. On one hand, this might suggest a C7 over B flat chord, which would serve as a 2 dominant 7 in the key of B flat minor. A somewhat typical, though still tasteful, diatonic secondary dominant chord. But by highlighting B-flat C and E natural together, we are also given a taste of the B-flat whole tone scale. In fact, moving to these notes from the D-flat and F of the B-flat minor chord has a downward chromatic movement that is highly reminiscent of similar movements in the previous section. At the end of this section, a B-flat minor is fully superimposed on an F minor 9 chord. Both of these chords fit neatly into the diatonic key of B-flat minor, but the F minor is a major third away from the subsequent D-flat minor, once again alluding to the previous section's augmented movements. This simultaneous usage of multiple harmonic functions, also known as polyvalence, occurs frequently in Altopiano Celeste. In some places it may merely serve a textural role, but in others it also helps to blend this track's contrasting harmonic concepts. As this section repeats a second time, a new guitar melody is added to the upper register. Here we see 2 earlier patterns. Each 2-note figure is a chromatic descent, and the figures themselves are separated by a major third, coinciding with the chord movements. And then, on the section's 3rd repetition, the B-flat minor over F minor is replaced by a new, highly dissonant chord. This could perhaps be labeled an E major flat 6 flat 9, though it should be clear that this is another example of polyvalence, suggesting the combination of F minor with an E 5th. This chord leads immediately back into the A section, and it does bear some resemblance to the F minor chord that marks the repetition of the A section. But in addition, the combination of E with the F minors A flat and C produces an augmented chord belonging to the B flat whole tone scale. This in turn follows the A section pattern of using this scale to return to the B flat or G flat root note. From here, the A section repeats, this time with a heavier guitar sound and drums, which then leads back into the B section with more of the same. But from there, this final F minor over E fifth leads into a new, increasingly chaotic section. Here, heavy chords alternate with tremolo-picked guitar melodies. The general structure here is a cycle consisting of a B-flat minor ninth chord, an A major seventh arpeggio chord, and then a whole tone sequence. This first chord change certainly seems to cover new ground. It's a non-diatonic chromatic change, vaguely akin to a slide transformation in neo-Riemannian terminology, yet the voicing of the B-flat minor ninth reveals a more familiar angle. If we ignore the root note for a moment, we can interpret the rest of the chord as a D-flat major seventh. The change from D-flat major seventh to A major seventh once again embodies a downward movement by a major third, differing from other such chromatic mediants in this track only in its use of major chords instead of minor chords. This movement traces out a D-flat augmented chord, but much like the A section, there are several notes mixed in that don't fit the corresponding A whole tone scale. Using the B-flat root note as an exception note is something we've seen before, but there are also the C, E, and G sharp to contend with. In fact, the notes in these chords don't seem to generally favor either whole tone scale. But it turns out there is another movement buried within these chords. From the B-flat minor ninths D-flat and F up a minor third to the A major sevenths E and G sharp. This is the same sort of movement seen throughout the B section, and in fact it mirrors exactly that section's use of polyvalence. Just as the B section's F minor moves down a major third to the D-flat minor, while its polyvalent B-flat minor moves up a minor third to the D-flat minor, the C section's D-flat major seventh moves down a major third to the A major seventh, while this major third interval moves up a minor third. And while the B section's polyvalence is built out of overlapping chords, the apparent polyvalence in the C section is much more subtle, occurring within individual chords. Crucially, omitting the A flat from the first chord and the C sharp from the second accentuates the appearance of this minor third movement. It's a rather covert use of these patterns, but nonetheless produces a certain consistency between these two sections. Of course, the other components of the C section, the two whole tone phrases, follow a much more conspicuous pattern. The first one is very short, arpeggiating an E-flat augmented chord, which belongs to the A whole tone scale. The second one is a bit longer and belongs instead to the B-flat whole tone scale. This imitates the A section's use of whole tone scales. Both sections begin with B-flat chords, and aside for certain exception notes, follow the A whole tone scale for 3 measures, before switching to the B-flat whole tone scale for 1 measure, leading back to the initial B-flat chord itself. But while the A section develops this pattern across 16 measures, 8 against B-flat and then another 8 against G-flat, the C section simply repeats the same 4-measure pattern, which seems to reflect the more aggressive pace of the music here. After a few repetitions of this section, it evolves into an alternative version consisting of 6 measures. In this version, the pace of the section's general components comes even more quickly. We reach the B-flat whole tone phrase after only 3 measures instead of 4. There are also new A major 7th voicings, a simple A major and an A major 7th sharp 11 underlaid with a B-flat pedal point, which muddy the chord change's delicate polyvalence. As a result, the harmonic pattern feels like it's breaking down, moving through a whirlwind of fluctuating tonalities. This is the peak of the track's chaos. By now, the major part of Altopiano Celeste's harmonic vocabulary should be clear. Some combination of whole tone or augmented patterns, specific chromatic mediant relationships, downward semitonal movements, and polyvalence appear within each section. There is incredible variety in how these concepts are deployed as well, leading to a whole spectrum of contrasting textures and moods. But by repeatedly drawing from the same concepts, the track maintains a consistent identity. And just like the explicit parallels between the A section and the C section, the subsequent D section bears a strong resemblance to the B section. I'll quickly point out that the final 2 notes of the C section, E and B flat, resolve classically to this initial F minor chord. But in any case, the D section consists of 3 chords, F minor, A minor, and D flat minor, and once again we see these chords are separated by major thirds. In fact, this pattern is more strictly observed here than in the B section. There, the B-flat minor chord deviated from the major third pattern and also partly concealed the presence of the more pattern-congruent F minor chord. But by replacing the B-flat minor with an A minor, the D section creates a perfectly symmetrical series of chromatic mediants whose root notes form a D-flat augmented chord. However, much like the B section, the D section avoids explicit whole tone scales in favor of regular diatonic chord voicings. All of these voicings end up displaying a degree of polyvalence. For example, this overlapping A minor and B7 over A is more or less identical to the B section's overlapping B flat minor and C7 over B flat. Likewise, this overlapping D flat minor and A flat minor is rather similar to the overlapping B flat minor and F minor that conclude the B section. The top notes of the D section chords also form a melodic phrase that is similar to the upper melody of the B section. Yet even though the D section's chords follow an augmented pattern more strictly than the B section, its upper melody is actually less conceptual. The B section's melody had a clear basis in downward chromatic movements and major third translations, but here these melodies are broken by changing the position of one note. After a couple of repetitions, we transition back to the C section, and the polyvalent voicing of this final D-flat minor chord ends up playing another role. Putting all these notes into a single chord gives us something like a D-flat minor ninth, which ends up moving into the C section's opening B-flat minor ninth. This is the same minor third movement, indeed the same exact chords that we saw in the B section, which we were at pains to figure out as an exception. Here, it becomes more clear that this particular change is used to pivot between two regimes, the D section chords rooted in the notes of a D-flat augmented triad, and the C section chords whose tonality relates to the section's initial B-flat minor. Another way of looking at this is that, since the minor third also separates relative major and minor chords, there is a parallel between the major chord shapes in the C section, D-flat major 7th and A major 7th, and the minor chord shapes in the D section, D-flat minor and A minor. This major-minor dichotomy comes to reflect these sections' tonalities as well, with the C section's whole tone theme being more compatible with major thirds, while the D section's diatonic voicings are more suited to minor thirds. This dichotomy is highlighted as the track weaves back and forth between the two sections. The second C section plays only its first version before plunging back into the D section. And then, finally, we proceed to the E section. Here, at long last, the track settles into a few normal, fully diatonic harmonies. It is easy to assign functions to most of these chords, revealing a fairly conventional 4 minor, 1 minor, flat 6, flat 3 progression. You can also think of this as a 4-1 motion in B-flat minor, followed by a 4-1 motion in its relative major key, D-flat major. Regardless, it sounds extremely consonant, and gives a long-awaited sense of resolution, which is much needed after 5 long minutes of twisting, non-functional whole-tone harmonies. After a few repetitions, additional guitar and choir parts join into this section, bolstering its sentimental diatonic sound. Of course, we still need to explain the final chord of this sequence. Being an augmented chord, it seems to draw upon the harmonic vocabulary used by the track's earlier sections. But among all these other diatonic chords, it is extremely tempting to assign a chord function to it. What exactly is this chord? The choir melody above it highlights the E-flat, and it's certainly possible to label the chord an E-flat augmented. With a kinship to the simple E-flat major, this chord could function as a 4 major, borrowed from the B-flat Dorian mode, which contains one fewer flat than the key of B-flat minor. But as the section ends, a brief figure highlights a low C-flat. Perhaps this is the chord's root note. Then we would label it a C-flat augmented, which, with a kinship to the C-flat major chord, would function as a flat 2 chord. Here we see a contradiction. This chord would be borrowed from the B-flat Phrygian mode, which contains one more flat than the key of B-flat minor. It's as though these two interpretations are pulling in opposite directions, or if you wanted to combine them into one interpretation, that is, a polyvalent interpretation, that the resultant chord has a paradoxical ambivalent quality. Naturally, this contrasts with the sense of direction or motivation that diatonic chords tend to have. The addition of the D natural to this augmented chord further heightens its ambivalence. It's almost impossible to make sense of this note in diatonic terms, and even in whole tone terms it is an exception note. It does have downward chromatic voice leading to the D-flat of this final C-flat major ninth figure, in parallel with the choir melody, but harmonically it is quite alien sounding. Nonetheless, this augmented chord's motion back towards the section's 1 chord still feels purposeful. How can we interpret this? It's true that augmented chords are sometimes used in conventional circumstances to produce tension, often in lieu of a 5-dominant chord. But you'd really have to stretch to make that explanation fit here. The C-flat augmented chord could be a substitute for a C-flat dominant 7th, which could then serve as a tritone substitution for an F7, itself the conventional 5-dominant chord in the key of B-flat minor. But these ideas aren't really a part of the track's harmonic vocabulary. It's far more sensible to appeal to the non-functional explanation, which relies on the C-flat augmented chord's voice leading and shared whole tones with the section's apparent 1 chord. Not to mention that Altopiano Celeste has already given us a precedent for this resolution. Looking back at the C section, we find the same E-flat augmented chord moving back to a B-flat minor chord. So despite its unusual qualities, this augmented chord has a consistent harmonic purpose. And moreover, it encapsulates both the whole tone and polyvalent aesthetics that are common throughout the track. By embedding this chord in an otherwise purely diatonic context, the track gears up for a full resolution as we move into its brief final section. Here, 2 guitars move between G-flat major and B-flat minor chords. These chords serve as a flat 6 and a 1 minor, both diatonic. For once, there aren't even any accidentals in our sheet music. There is a vague suggestion of polyvalence, as the first 2 measures in the first guitar are reused and slightly reharmonized by the second guitar. But since everything stays within the key of B-flat minor, this overlapping is a textural feature only. I like to imagine this track as a terrifying whole tone labyrinth. The E section was the light at the end of the tunnel, and now the F section is the final escape. As this section repeats to the track's conclusion, its tempo slows down further and further. Now that we've escaped, we can finally stop running. So, what have we learned? Altopiano Celeste is a very complex, detailed track, and on first listen some of these details may come across as arbitrary. But on closer inspection, there are some very tight compositional principles at work here. Much of this boils down to the use of whole tone scales and the augmented chords that these scales contain. For instance, this track is full of chromatic mediant relationships separated by major thirds, and several sections also follow clear patterns in how they alternate between 2 different whole tone scales or in what exception notes are allowed within these scales. Some of the other compositional principles involve smaller concepts. For example, recurrent chord voicings and melodic motifs, the use of downward chromatic motion, and one particular chromatic mediant over a minor third interval. Of course, in many cases, these concepts end up relating back to the primary whole tone principle. But all of this is balanced with the use of regular diatonic harmony as well, which prevents the track from ever sounding too abstract. This sense of balance is epitomized by one final technique, polyvalence, or the use of multiple simultaneous chord functions, often expressed as overlapping chords. In many cases, this technique is used to reconcile whole tone and diatonic features within the same section, though it also generally adds texture to what is already a harmonically rich track. I think Altopiano Celeste serves as an excellent example of the non-functional harmony that is often used in death metal and black metal. However, I don't think it's the techniques in and of themselves that make it a good example, but rather the way in which the techniques are arranged. From this perspective, the track is organized by patterns and symmetries. The repetition of techniques within this structure creates many permutations in how they can relate to each other, which in turn produces a sound that is diverse but still has lots of conceptual consistency. This kind of organization doesn't rely on particular techniques. After all, the whole tone scale is far from being the only symmetrical scale. The diminished scales, for instance, have 4-fold translational symmetry, and the less commonly used augmented scale has 3-fold translational symmetry. There are also scales with mirror symmetries, sets of scales that are mutually symmetrical, and many more granular instances of symmetry. Not to mention patterns, which form such a non-specific abstract category that there are probably unlimited examples of it. My point is that using these broad concepts as compositional principles enables tracks to be built from the mutating relationships of only a few different underlying techniques. The aesthetic consistency that results from this approach is what makes these tracks compelling, even when the harmony happens to end up being unfamiliar or outright dissonant. Of course, a dissonant, alien sound is often desirable in death metal and black metal, Perhaps this is even why the symmetry and pattern-based composition of these genres evolved in the first place, simply in pursuit of artfulness that is not reliant on or even renounces the familiar consonants of diatonic harmonies. I also want to point out that the use of these principles need not be 100% intentional. As with most other genres of music, a good ear is sufficient to write good metal, and these music theory concepts are often subsumed by mere artists' intuition. I'm sure Gabriele included many of Altopiano Celeste's patterns and symmetries intentionally, but there are also probably a few that were not intentional. These became a part of the track simply because they sounded good, as patterns and symmetries often do. This concludes my music theory analysis of Altopiano Celeste. Once again, I give my thanks to Gabriele for his help with this analysis, and of course for writing such an excellent track to begin with. I really recommend checking out his upcoming album. The link is in the description. And if you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.